Alrighty, so welcome back, everyone. Thanks again for coming. So if you were here over the last 2 weeks, I shared the stories of Nathanial and Elizabeth Britton, a pair of botanists who got married in the late 1800s and worked together on their plant research into the 1930s. And in Elizabeth's presentation, I mentioned 2 other female botanists that she had worked with. And so today I'll talk a little bit about the first of them, Annie Morrill Smith. And here in Tennessee, I looked and we only have just one specimen, at least that I could find in our collection that she had collected. You can see here, she's the collector and the determiner for this specimen. She collected it in June of 1901 in the vicinity of Chilson Lake, Essex County, New York. Now, Chilson Lake is today Eagle Lake, and it's located in the Adirondack Park, which is a state forest preserve in the Adirondack Mountains. And so, which looks quite pretty there. So because this specimen is from the United States, so it was part of actually the first bryophyte and lichen project that started back in 2011. So we don't actually have a picture of the specimen of the contents on the portal. So at that time, at that project, they were really just imaging the outside, all the label information. But I did want to show you the specimen. So I went to the collection and I tracked it down and I took a picture with my phone. So here it is. Not a great picture, but you can still get an idea of what it looks like. And I thought also too, in this, interestingly, you'll notice some of our older packets are actually attached to the sheets using pins instead of staples. So you do have to be careful when you're handling them that you're not poking yourself. The species is Perilla platyphylla, which is actually a liverwort, so not a moss. And we talked a little bit about liverworts in a previous presentation. It's another type of non-vascular plant. They can be leafy, like kind of similar to mosses, but they can also have more of like a lobed structure like this, and those are called thallus or thalloid liverworts. You may also remember that they have some really interesting, kind of cool looking reproductive structures, either asexual reproduction and asexual reproduction, which is pretty interesting. So our species, Perilla platyphylla, is a liverwort that lives on dry calcareous rocks or alkaline bark. And I found these nice photos on the British Bryological Society's website, so you can get an idea of what it looks like out in the field. So Annie Morrill Smith was an American botanist, bryologist, and genealogist. She was born Annie Elizabeth Morrill in 1856 in the Brooklyn Heights neighborhood of New York City, which is right here. Her family seems to have been fairly well off, and her father was a physician. She was educated at the Packer Collegiate Institute, which was a prep school for grades preschool through 12, and it was founded in 1845 as the Brooklyn Female Academy, and it's still around today. So it's now a co-ed private K through 12 school. In an interesting pop cultural reference, a side note, I found that the school's interior and exterior were used as a setting for the filming of the TV show Gossip Girl. So it might look familiar if you're familiar with that show. So while there, Smith was a good student. In a short autobiographical entry that I found, she says that she was never late or absent from school, but, quote, "This was just according to my nature and nothing to boast of." She also wrote that during her junior year, she had to withdraw from school due to health problems. So she never actually officially graduated. She did spend 2 years traveling and studying in Europe from 1878 to 79. She said, quote, "It did something towards making up for this great loss, but I have ever felt the lack of this crown to the foundation of my education." She developed an interest in botany during her travels, but was largely a self-taught amateur, so she never received a formal botany degree. In 1880, she married Hugh Montgomery Smith, who was a physician like her father. And in the late 1890s, she began studying cryptogamic botany, so mosses, liverworts, and lichens. It was through that she met Elizabeth Britton, who was by then a respected name in biology. She was a great resource for Smith in studying and identifying her specimens, and the two became good friends. As I mentioned last time, or previous times, she called Britton Sister Bryophyte in her letters. Smith herself wrote, If it had not been for Mrs. Britton's constant companionship and willingness to hear all my trials and help to solve the many problems that arose as they arose, I would never have been able to do my part of the work. To her, I owe my education in the study of cryptogams, and in fact, all that I have accomplished in this line in the 18 years since beginning the work in 1898. So her husband died unexpectedly in 1897, and after that, she became even more active in bryology. So Smith was most notably involved in two important undertakings in the early history of the botanical bryological community in the United States. The first is the creation of the journal The Bryologist, which is still and very important today. In 1898, Abel Joel Grout, who was a bryologist who studied under Elizabeth Britton, published a 4-page moss department in a publication called the Fern Bulletin, which was run by botanist Willard Clute. It included a note that this department is opened with the purpose of enabling anyone at all interested in mosses to get some knowledge of those plants without excessive labor or expense. The editor will try also to identify for subscribers difficult specimens accompanied by notes and postage. It is also hoped that the bulletin may become a medium for communication of bryological notes of interest in the same way that has been so admirably done in the case of ferns and fern allies. So this section was renamed The Bryologist in subsequent issues of the Fern Bulletin. That same fall, Smith was approached by Elizabeth Britton about helping to plan and set up a formal society for people interested in mosses, which Grout and Britton would co-found as the Sullivant Moss Society. Annual dues, I thought this was interesting, for the society were 50 cents for active members and 25 cents for associate members. It was named after William Starling Sullivant, called the Prince of American Bryologists, and he was an early American botanist and authority on bryophytes who passed away in 1873. And the Sullivant Moss Society would eventually become the American Bryological and Lichenological Society. So it seems there's a bit of disagreement about who first came up with the idea for a moss society. There are a few different histories written up during their lifetimes that hint at some debate. Smith, in her history of the society, says it was probably thought of by several people. Grout considered himself at least the first to act on it because he published the Moss Department. And Smith did call him the father of the journal and called Elizabeth Britton the godmother of the Sullivant Moss Society. So it sounds like there may have been some drama. Apparently these two did not get along, which was interesting, and Smith kind of had to act as a bit of a mediator to smooth things over. And I won't go far into the details, but I think it's always kind of funny and interesting and strange to read about drama that happened 100 years ago. Smith was one of the 34 charter members in the society and was elected as their first secretary treasurer in 1899. And she also started the society's herbarium. In 1900, the Bryologist became its own independent journal. Smith joined the journal as an associate editor, and I put this in quotes because it sounds like in reality she was mainly, if not solely, responsible for the management of the journal, and she was definitely responsible for all the financing. She noted herself that until volume 9 in 1906, her name is listed alongside Grout's, but that she was really the one doing everything. From 1906, she was acknowledged as the sole editor, and by 1910, the publication had grown from 4 pages sent out quarterly to 24 pages sent out bi-monthly. And aside from overseeing the publishing of submissions from other contributors, she wrote book reviews, obituaries, her own botanical notes, and the Moss Society's annual reports. Speaking of the Moss Society, it grew quickly from 34 to over 200 members. Smith served as its treasurer for 10 years, vice president for 7 years, and president for 2 years, and funded its operations with her own money. So now she was very privileged to come from a wealthy family. She had her own personal wealth from her marriage. But as time went by, she began to acknowledge that she really couldn't keep going on the way that she was. She notes that in her work on the journal, she had spent a deficit of $2,132.98 of her own money, which she considered as her contribution to the advancement of science during the past 11 years, but it wasn't sustainable. And she said the mechanical work had outgrown her physical strength. So in 1910, she started negotiations to transition the Bryologist's responsibilities kind of back to the Sullivant Moss Society. And arrangements were finalized in 1911. At first, Dr. Grout took over, but it was too much work for him. So it ended up being managed by an advisory board of the society's officers and 4 associated editors. So it's kind of impressive to think she was doing all that work by herself for a decade. In 1913, she donated her herbarium of 20,000 cryptogam specimens to the newly opened Botanic Garden and Laboratory of the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences. She also, at that time, gave away her microscopes and technical equipment, claiming to be closing out the chapter of active botanical work. She did keep her large library of botanical books, saying that she did have some botanical work to do. So she didn't completely leave the field of botany, but just pulled back from doing research. In 1917, she wrote an article in the Bryologist on the early history of the journal and the society, and it's actually one of the sources I used for this presentation, so I'll definitely link that out afterwards if you're interested. Later in her life, she became very involved in genealogy and published a number of books on the history of her family, which you'll see some of them here. And in one of them, I found her own short autobiography that added a lot of nice personal information that was great to find for the presentation. So Smith passed away in 1946 at the age of 90. So good long life. I don't have a record of her describing new species or having species named after her. She didn't really contribute, or doesn't seem to have contributed as a taxonomist, but she was recognized. So in the Women's Who's Who of America book, she was listed for her work on the Bryologist journal and the Sullivant Moss Society. Specimen-wise, there's really not a lot in the Symbiota that I could find. It's kind of hard to filter. She has a very common last name. Sometimes she just uses her initials, so I'm sure I didn't find everything. But I did find at least 62 specimens in the Bryophyte portal, and those are collected mostly from New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Vermont, also Virginia and North Carolina. Just 1 lichen and just 2 vascular specimens in our Cernax Symbiota, including one of which is this fern. And then I found 29 specimens in GBIF. So it seems likely there's probably a lot more out there that haven't been digitized or that I just couldn't find accessible. But definitely this is not all of those. Yeah, so that is Annie Morrill Smith. And I'll end again with a little bit of a longer quote this time. It says, "She had a brilliant and organized mind and a very appealing nature. To my regret, I never met her. It is generally admitted that without her, neither the Bryologist nor the Bryological Society could have survived. She supplied the new and struggling organization with much time, energy, and especially money. In his editorial in the volume 3, number 1, Grout had this to say about her: the success of the Sullivant Moss chapter is due very largely to the efforts of its secretary, Annie Morrill Smith, who has devoted time, strength, and money to the work of the chapter to an extent little realized except by a very few." So yeah, so again, another important figure in the history of bryology. Who knows if we'd have the Bryologist magazine without her early efforts. So thanks again for listening.